The small cemetery on the outskirts of Millfield, Connecticut, was a place most locals preferred to forget. Nestled between overgrown maple trees and wild honeysuckle bushes, it stood as a humble reminder of mortality, far from the bustling downtown with its artisan coffee shops and renovated Victorian homes. The narrow dirt pathways winding between modest gravestones remained largely untraveled except for the occasional groundskeeper, but those who passed by early enough might notice a curious sight. A thin boy with worn-out sneakers and a backpack too big for his frame, slipping through the side gate just as dawn broke over the eastern hills. Every morning, without fail, 10-year-old Ethan Riley would make this solitary journey, clutching wildflowers gathered from vacant lots along his way. He moved between the gravestones with the familiarity of someone visiting an old friend, his path unwavering until he reached a simple marker in the cemetery's quietest corner. The headstone was unadorned. No photograph, just a name etched with simplicity and a date from 3 years earlier. Unlike the neighboring graves with their plastic flowers and trinkets, this one received no visitors except him. No one else brought flowers. No one lit candles, only Ethan, always alone. On this particular Tuesday morning, the summer air hung heavy with humidity as Ethan placed his collection of Black-Eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace at the base of the stone. He sat cross-legged on the patchy grass, brushing away a few stray leaves. "Good morning, Mom," he whispered, his voice carrying no sadness, only the comfortable familiarity of routine. "Mrs. Wilson made banana bread yesterday. Said I could take some to school, but I saved you a piece." From his backpack, he carefully extracted a small piece wrapped in a napkin, placing it beside the flowers. He never stayed for more than an hour, sometimes just minutes, but he came every day without exception. 20 miles away, in the gleaming glass headquarters of Northeast Logistics Solutions, Marshall Thompson stared out of his corner office window, seeing nothing of the Hartford skyline before him. At 45, he had achieved everything society deemed valuable: a portfolio of international investments, a sprawling estate in West Hartford's most exclusive neighborhood, and a reputation as one of New England's most ruthless yet successful businessmen. The Wall Street Journal had once called him Connecticut's Logistics King, a title he'd leveraged into contracts worth billions. But none of that seemed to matter this morning. "Mr. Thompson?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The Tokyo investors are waiting in conference room 3. Marshall blinked, dragging himself back to the present. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. He straightened his custom-tailored suit and adjusted his tie, a mask of composed professionalism slipping back into place. Only those closest to him might notice the slight redness around his eyes, or the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight. 3 weeks had passed since his father's funeral, a private affair with more business associates than family members in attendance. Marshall had maintained perfect composure throughout, shaking hands and accepting condolences with practiced grace. It was only later, alone in his cavernous house, that something unexpected had cracked within him. The relationship with his father had been complicated at best, a retired Navy captain who viewed emotional distance as character building. They'd spoken weekly out of obligation rather than affection, conversations centered around business news and market projections. Yet somehow the finality of his absence had opened something raw and unfamiliar in Marshall, something that business meetings and quarterly reports couldn't fill. That evening, after mechanically concluding the conference call with Tokyo, Marshall cancelled his dinner reservation at Hartford's most exclusive restaurant. Instead, he found himself driving without destination, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a small cemetery he'd noticed on his rare trips to the company's warehouse district. The impulse was inexplicable. He hadn't visited his own father's grave since the funeral. Yet something drew him to walk among these humble markers, so different from the elaborate family mausoleum where generations of Thompsons rested. He returned the following evening, and again 2 days later. On his 4th visit, as golden hour cast long shadows between the gravestones, Marshall noticed a small figure moving between the markers. The sight was jarring. A child no more than 10 or 11, carefully arranging wildflowers before a simple headstone. Marshall kept his distance, observing with unexpected curiosity. The boy didn't cry. He didn't appear particularly sad. He simply sat before the grave with the comfortable posture of someone engaged in conversation with a dear friend. The scene stirred something unfamiliar in Marshall's chest. As days passed, He found himself returning to the cemetery at different hours, occasionally glimpsing the boy's morning ritual from a respectful distance. There was something compelling about the child's devotion, something that made Marshall increasingly curious about whose grave commanded such faithful attention. On this morning, Marshall had cancelled his meetings and arrived just after dawn, parking his Mercedes far enough away to remain unobtrusive. He watched as the boy completed his visit, speaking inaudibly to the stone, before finally standing, brushing grass from his jeans and walking away. Only when the small figure disappeared through the side gate did Marshall approach the grave. The name carved into the simple marker made him freeze mid-step, a combination of first and last name that, while not entirely uncommon, sent a jolt of recognition through his body. His breath caught, his heart hammered against his ribs. It was a name he knew, a name he had chosen to forget. 7 years earlier, when Northeast Logistics was still a regional operation fighting for major contracts, Marshall had briefly dated a young woman who worked in their customer service department. Jessica Riley had been beautiful, warm, and refreshingly direct. Everything his usual social circle was not. Their relationship had been intense, passionate, and completely compartmentalized from his professional life. When a major expansion opportunity arose requiring his relocation to Boston for 6 months, he'd ended things abruptly. He changed his number, ignored her messages, and convinced himself it was for the best. Clean breaks were always his style, in business and in personal matters. But standing before that modest gravestone, Marshall felt the ground shift beneath his expensive shoes. The dates aligned too perfectly. The boy's age, his features, certain expressions that had seemed vaguely familiar, now took on new significance. Marshall's analytical mind, trained to assess risks and opportunities, began connecting dots he had deliberately scattered years ago. In the days that followed, he found himself observing the boy with greater attention, noting details he'd previously overlooked: the shape of his eyes, the determined set of his jaw, the particular way he tilted his head when lost in thought, all mirrors of Marshall's own mannerisms. Discreetly, he commissioned his most trusted attorney to obtain records. The boy's name was Ethan Riley. His mother, Jessica, had succumbed to pneumonia complications 3 years earlier, complications exacerbated by inadequate medical care and delayed treatment due to lack of insurance. The birth certificate listed no father. The attorney reported that Ethan now lived with an elderly neighbor, a Mrs. Wilson, who had taken him in after Jessica's passing. He attended school sporadically, sold candy at traffic lights, and cleaned windshields to earn pocket money. For the first time in decades, Marshall Thompson cancelled his schedule indefinitely. The man who prided himself on decisive action now found himself paralyzed by a choice he never anticipated having to make. In his sleek home office, surrounded by awards and accolades, he stared at a photograph of Ethan that his investigator had discreetly obtained. The boy had Marshall's eyes. Marshall spent a sleepless night staring at his ceiling, memories flooding back with merciless clarity. Jessica Riley had been unlike anyone he'd ever known, a woman with an associate's degree working toward her bachelor's while managing full-time employment. He remembered how she'd laugh at his corporate jargon, challenging him to speak like a human, how she'd dragged him to community theater productions instead of the symphony, how she never seemed impressed by his wealth, but lit up when he remembered small details about her day. The relationship had been unexpected, a deviation from his carefully mapped life plan. When the opportunity arose to oversee Northeast Logistics' expansion to Boston, Marshall had made his choice swiftly and clinically. His last conversation with Jessica replayed in his mind, her confusion, then hurt, then quiet dignity as she accepted his decision. She never pleaded, never caused a scene, just looked at him with those clear eyes and said, "I hope you find what you're looking for, Marshall." He remembered feeling relieved at how cleanly it had ended. Now, with the benefit of years and the weight of discovery, he recognized her restraint for what it was. Strength he had mistaken for simplicity. Had she known she was pregnant then? The timeline suggested it was possible. Marshall rose before dawn, driving to the cemetery earlier than usual. He parked at a distance, waiting. When Ethan appeared through the morning mist, Marshall studied him with new awareness. The boy moved with a quiet confidence, unusual for his age. His clothes were worn but clean, his backpack mended with careful stitches. Today's flowers were purple coneflowers and white daisies, arranged with deliberate care at the base of Jessica's headstone. The math test went okay, Marshall overheard as he edged closer, remaining partially hidden behind a large oak tree. Mrs. Wilson helped me study. I got most of the fractions right. The boy's one-sided conversation continued, updating his mother on neighborhood happenings, school challenges, and a stray dog he'd befriended. Not once did he mention hardship or need, though both were evident in his patched clothing and too-thin frame. When Ethan finally departed for school, Marshall approached the grave. Standing before Jessica's name etched in stone, he felt an unfamiliar constriction in his throat. "I didn't know," he whispered, though whether it was an explanation or an apology he couldn't say. The following day, Marshall arrived at the offices of family law attorney Patricia Lawson with uncharacteristic hesitation. Usually, attorneys came to him, in his office, on his terms. Today felt different. "I need to understand my options," he explained, after briefly outlining the situation, careful to maintain his composure. "If the child is indeed mine, DNA testing would be the first step," Patricia interrupted, her expression professional but not unkind. "Then, if paternity is established, we discuss whether you're seeking visitation rights or full custody." "Custody," Marshall said without hesitation, surprising himself with the immediacy of his response. "But I want to approach this carefully. The boy has experienced enough disruption." Patricia leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, forgive my directness, but why now? You've been absent for 10 years. The question landed like a physical blow. Marshall considered his standard approach: deflection, assertion of authority, redirection. Instead, he found himself answering with uncomfortable honesty. "I didn't know he existed until recently. And now that I do," he trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow, "I've made many decisions based solely on what benefits me. This can't be one of them." The process began discreetly. DNA testing confirmed what Marshall already knew in his bones: Ethan was unquestionably his son. The social worker assigned to the case, Gabriela Montes, didn't bother hiding her skepticism during their initial meeting. "Forgive me for being blunt, Mr. Thompson, but your lifestyle doesn't exactly scream father material," she noted, glancing around his minimalist living room with its expensive art and distinct absence of anything child-friendly. "When was the last time you interacted with a child?" Marshall couldn't remember. His sister's children lived in California, and he sent extravagant gifts on birthdays and Christmas rather than visiting. His social circle consisted exclusively of other executives, investors, and occasional companions who understood his preference for relationships with clear beginnings and endings. "I'm willing to learn," he said finally, "and to make whatever changes are necessary." Gabriela's expression softened slightly. "That's a start, but Ethan's well-being comes first. He's experienced significant trauma and instability. Mrs. Wilson has provided consistency despite her limited resources. We don't disrupt that lightly, regardless of biological connections or financial advantages." Marshall nodded, feeling uncharacteristically humbled. "I understand. How do you suggest I proceed?" "Slowly," Gabriela advised. "Begin with brief, casual interactions. Build trust before revealing your identity. Children in Ethan's situation have often been disappointed by adults. Don't be another disappointment." The first approach happened on a Saturday morning at the cemetery. Marshall timed his arrival to coincide with Ethan's departure, deliberately wearing casual clothes instead of his usual suit. He nodded respectfully as their paths crossed. "Good morning," he offered simply. Ethan regarded him with cautious curiosity, but returned the greeting before continuing on his way. For 3 weeks, Marshall maintained this pattern. Brief greetings, occasional comments about the weather, nothing that might seem intrusive. He observed how Ethan's initial wariness gradually softened into familiar acknowledgement. On the 4th Saturday, Marshall arrived with gardening gloves and a small brush. Ethan found him carefully cleaning debris from neighboring gravestones. "You visiting someone?" the boy asked, his natural caution tempered by growing familiarity. Marshall nodded toward a random marker. "Just paying respects." They worked in companionable silence, Ethan arranging his flowers, while Marshall continued his self-assigned task. Before leaving, the boy hesitated. "I'm Ethan," he offered. "Marshall," he replied, careful not to use his surname. which might be recognized from local business news. Nice flowers. Mom liked wildflowers better than store ones, Ethan explained. Said they worked harder to grow. The simple statement hit Marshall with unexpected force. It sounded exactly like something Jessica would say. Their interactions gradually extended beyond brief cemetery encounters. Marshall coincidentally appeared at the diner, where Mrs. Wilson occasionally treated Ethan to Saturday lunch. He struck up conversations about the Boston Red Sox, discovering Ethan's encyclopedic knowledge of baseball statistics, despite never having attended a game. When he learned the boy struggled with math, he casually offered assistance, framing it as repayment for Ethan showing him the best wildflower spots near the cemetery. Each interaction was carefully documented for Gabriella, who monitored the developing relationship with professional thoroughness. He's smart, Marshall told her during their weekly check-in, resourceful, resilient. He shouldn't have to be selling candy at traffic lights. And Mrs. Wilson, Gabriella prompted. She clearly cares for him deeply, Marshall acknowledged. But she's 82 with arthritis and a fixed income. She can barely manage her own needs, let alone a growing boy's. What he didn't say, what seemed increasingly clear with each passing week, was how profoundly these interactions were changing him. The man who once measured success in acquisitions and profit margins now found himself researching local school districts and children's bedroom furniture. The revelation of his identity would require careful timing and professional support. Marshall insisted on having both Gabriella and Mrs. Wilson present, along with Dr. Karen Chen, a child psychologist specializing in family transitions. They gathered in Mrs. Wilson's modest living room on a Sunday afternoon. The contrast between Marshall's bespoke casual wear and the worn furniture, a visual reminder of the different worlds about to collide. Ethan entered from the kitchen, stopping short when he saw the unusual gathering. His eyes found Marshall's, confusion evident. "What's going on?" he asked, instinctively moving closer to Mrs. Wilson. Marshall had rehearsed this moment countless times, crafting and discarding explanations. Now, facing Ethan's direct gaze, all prepared speeches evaporated. "I knew your mother," he began simply, his voice steadier than he felt. "A long time ago." The boy's expression shifted, surprise, confusion, and something harder to define. "You did?" Marshall nodded, maintaining eye contact despite the tightness in his chest. "Yes, and I've recently learned something I should have known years ago." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. "Ethan, I'm your father." The silence that followed Marshall's revelation seemed to stretch indefinitely. Ethan's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and a flash of something that looked like anger before settling into careful neutrality. A mask Marshall recognized from his own reflection. "That's not true," Ethan said finally, his voice steady despite the slight trembling of his hands. "My mom would have told me." Mrs. Wilson reached for Ethan's shoulder, her weathered hand gentle. "Your mother did mention your father sometimes, honey. She said he was someone important who lived a different kind of life." Ethan shook his head, taking a step back. "If you're my dad, where were you? Where were you when Mom got sick? When she couldn't afford medicine, when they took our apartment?" Each question landed like a physical blow. Marshall had prepared logical explanations, had rehearsed expressions of regret, but facing the raw hurt in Ethan's eyes, everything felt inadequate. "I didn't know," he said simply. "I didn't know about you, or that your mother was ill. That doesn't excuse my absence, but it's the truth." Gabriella intervened with professional calm, explaining the DNA confirmation while Dr. Chen watched Ethan's reactions carefully. The boy listened with unnatural stillness, his young face showing a composure that seemed borrowed from someone much older. When they finished, he looked directly at Marshall. "I don't need a dad," he stated flatly. "Mrs. Wilson and I are fine." The elderly woman beside him blinked rapidly, clearly fighting tears. "Ethan," she said softly, "you know I love having you with me. But my arthritis is getting worse, and the doctor says I might need surgery soon." She glanced at Marshall before continuing. "We need to think about what's best for your future." Ethan's composure cracked slightly. "You're giving me away?" The hurt in his voice made everyone in the room flinch. "No, honey, never that," Mrs. Wilson assured him. "But we need to consider all options." Dr. Chen suggested ending the meeting, recognizing Ethan's emotional overload. As the adults rose, Ethan slipped out the front door without a word. Marshall moved to follow, but Gabriella stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Give him space," she advised. "This is a lot to process. Pushing now will only reinforce his perception of you as an intruder." The custody process proceeded with bureaucratic thoroughness despite Marshall's impatience. Background checks, home evaluations, psychological assessments, and parenting classes filled his formerly business-dominated schedule. His executive team watched in bewilderment as their always available CEO began declining evening meetings and rescheduling international calls. Following the professionals' advice, Marshall maintained regular but unpressured contact with Ethan, brief interactions that allowed the boy to maintain his sense of control. They met for ice cream, visited the science museum, and occasionally worked together on the math problems Ethan found challenging. Each encounter ended before Ethan showed signs of discomfort. Each goodbye came with reassurance that Marshall would return as promised. The boy's initial resistance gradually softened into cautious curiosity. One afternoon, as they walked through the park after a successful math tutoring session, Ethan asked abruptly, "Were you and my mom in love?" The question caught Marshall off guard. His instinct was to offer a sanitized version of the truth, but something in Ethan's direct gaze demanded honesty. "Yes," he answered after a moment, "though I don't think I understood then what that really meant." They walked several steps in silence before Ethan spoke again. "She kept your picture in her jewelry box. I found it after..." He trailed off, unable to directly reference his mother's absence. "I didn't know who you were then." Marshall absorbed this information with a strange mixture of guilt and gratitude. Jessica had kept his photograph despite everything. Had she intended to tell Ethan about him someday? Had circumstances simply overtaken that intention? "What was she like?" he asked quietly. "As a mom, I mean." For the first time since they'd met, Ethan's expression brightened with unguarded enthusiasm. The best, she worked a lot but always made time for stories. She could do all the character voices. His words tumbled out with increasing animation. "We had movie nights every Friday with popcorn, even when money was tight. And she never got mad when I brought home bugs or weird rocks for my collection." Marshall listened, hungrily absorbing these glimpses of the life he'd never known, of the woman Jessica had become, of the mother she'd been to their son. The custody hearing arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Marshall's attorney had assured him it was largely procedural given the uncontested DNA results, Mrs. Wilson's support, and the positive reports from both Gabriella and Dr. Chen. Still, as he straightened his conservative tie and checked his reflection, an unfamiliar anxiety gripped him. What if Ethan had changed his mind? What if the judge saw through him to the selfish man he'd been for most of his life? What if he failed at this most important venture? The courtroom was smaller than he'd imagined, the proceedings less formal. Ethan sat beside Mrs. Wilson, wearing the new button-down shirt and pressed khakis Marshall had purchased for the occasion. The boy's expression was solemn, but no longer hostile. When the judge asked if he understood what was happening, Ethan nodded and answered the questions directed to him with clear, thoughtful responses that belied his 10 years. The judge reviewed the documentation, asked several clarifying questions, and then granted Marshall full legal custody with generous visitation arrangements for Mrs. Wilson. "Congratulations, Mr. Thompson," she concluded. "I believe you understand the responsibility you're assuming today." Marshall nodded, the weight of her words settling on him with unexpected gravity. "I do, Your Honor." As they left the courtroom, Ethan hesitated before taking a half step closer to Marshall. It wasn't quite trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. The first night in Marshall's home was awkwardly silent. Despite weeks of preparation, consulting with designers specializing in children's spaces, reading parenting books, child-proofing the house, nothing had prepared him for the reality of this small person's presence in his carefully ordered world. Ethan stood in the center of his new bedroom, touching nothing, his backpack still strapped to his shoulders as if preparing for a quick departure. "You can change anything you don't like," Marshall offered, gesturing to the room decorated in baseball themes based on Ethan's casual mentions of favorite teams. "The designer said we could swap out furniture or colors if you prefer something different." Ethan shook his head, finally setting his backpack down. "It's nice, thank you." His politeness felt like a wall between them. Later, after an equally stilted dinner where Marshall realized he had no idea what foods 10-year-olds preferred, he found Ethan sitting on his bed, staring at the framed photograph of Jessica that Marshall had placed on the nightstand. It was the best image he'd found in the items Mrs. Wilson had saved, Jessica laughing at something off camera, her eyes crinkled with genuine joy. "I wasn't sure if you'd want that there," Marshall said from the doorway, "but I thought it might help." Ethan nodded without looking up. "Can we still visit her? At the cemetery?" The question caught Marshall by surprise. He'd assumed Ethan would want to maintain the cemetery visits, but hadn't wanted to presume. "Of course, whenever you want." A tiny bit of tension left the boy's shoulders. "I promised I'd go every day," he explained, "so she wouldn't be alone." Marshall moved carefully into the room, sitting at the farthest edge of the bed to maintain Ethan's space. "We can go every day," he affirmed. "Before school, after school, whatever works best." Ethan studied him with that disconcertingly direct gaze. "You won't get too busy?" "Mom said you were always busy with important things." The simple observation carried no accusation, which somehow made it more devastating. Marshall thought of all the calls he'd ignored, the letters he'd returned unopened. "Nothing is more important than this," he said, surprising himself with how deeply he meant it. The morning routine developed its own rhythm. They would rise early, share a quick breakfast, and drive to the cemetery before school. Marshall would wait by the car, giving Ethan privacy for his conversations with Jessica. Afterwards, he'd drop Ethan at school before heading to the office for a now compressed workday that ended precisely at 3 o'clock. His executive team had adapted to their CEO's transformed schedule with varying degrees of confusion and reluctant respect. Evenings were filled with homework supervision, awkward attempts at conversation, and Marshall's increasingly less disastrous efforts at cooking family dinners. Though they developed functional routines, emotional distance remained. Ethan was unfailingly polite, but rarely initiated conversation. He kept his few possessions meticulously organized, left no trace of himself in common areas, and never asked for anything beyond basic necessities, behaviors that Dr. Chen gently identified as survival mechanisms from years of insecurity. "Give him time," she advised during their weekly session. "Children who've experienced loss develop protective barriers. Your consistency matters more than grand gestures." Marshall nodded, thinking of the expensive toys gathering dust in Ethan's closet. Gifts purchased in those early weeks when he'd mistakenly believed material items could bridge the chasm between them. The real breakthrough came unexpectedly, 6 weeks after Ethan moved in. Marshall woke at his usual early hour to find Ethan's bedroom empty, the bed neatly made. Panic surged through him until he noticed a small piece of paper on the kitchen counter. "Gone to see Mom. Back soon. E." Relief mingled with concern as Marshall grabbed his keys and drove to the cemetery, arriving just as dawn broke over the eastern hills. He spotted Ethan immediately, kneeling before Jessica's headstone with his usual collection of wildflowers. But something was different this morning. The boy's shoulders were shaking, his usual composed demeanor cracked open by quiet sobs. Marshall hesitated, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. Ethan had never cried in his presence, had maintained careful control of his emotions even during the most difficult transitions. Witnessing this private grief felt like an intrusion, yet walking away seemed like abandonment. Taking a deep breath, Marshall moved forward, his footsteps deliberately audible on the gravel path. Ethan quickly wiped his face when he heard Marshall approaching, squaring his small shoulders in an attempt to regain composure. The familiar gesture, so reminiscent of Marshall's own reflexive hiding of vulnerability, made something twist painfully in his chest. "Sorry," Ethan mumbled, not meeting Marshall's eyes. "I left a note." Marshall nodded, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I saw it. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He hesitated, then added softly, "It's all right to miss her, Ethan." The boy's chin trembled slightly before he pressed his lips together. "Today's her birthday," he explained, his voice barely audible. "We always had pancakes with rainbow sprinkles for breakfast on birthdays." The simple detail, so ordinary, yet so profoundly meaningful, hit Marshall with unexpected force. Jessica would have been 34 today. A woman he'd once known intimately was now a collection of memories he could never share, moments he'd forfeited through his own choices. "Would you like pancakes with rainbow sprinkles this morning?" he offered, surprising himself. "I'm not sure I know how to make them, but we could try together." Ethan looked up, genuine surprise breaking through his careful mask. You don't have meetings? Marshall shook his head. Nothing that can't wait. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of reassessment. Okay, he agreed quietly. They stood together for a moment before the simple granite marker, the silence between them somehow less strained than before. Before turning to leave, Marshall reached into his pocket and withdrew something he'd been carrying for days, waiting for the right moment. "I thought you might want this," he said, holding out a small silver frame containing a photograph he'd discovered in his long-abandoned personal storage. Jessica, at 27, laughing on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard, her hair blown wild by sea winds. Ethan took it with visible wonder, running his fingers over the image. "I've never seen this one," he whispered. "She looks happy." Marshall nodded, a knot forming in his throat. She was. Their pancake attempt that morning was disastrous. Too much baking powder, sprinkles that melted into unappetizing swirls, and smoke alarms triggered by too high heat. Yet somehow, amidst the chaos of flour-dusted countertops and failed flips, something shifted. Ethan laughed, genuinely laughed, when Marshall's spectacular flip attempt ended with pancake batter on the ceiling. By the time they salvaged breakfast with cereal and toast, they'd established a tiny foothold of shared experience. At school drop-off, instead of the usual polite nod, Ethan hesitated before saying, "See you after school, Marshall." Not Dad, perhaps never Dad, but his actual name, spoken with something approaching comfort. It was enough. Their routines gradually evolved from parallel existences into something resembling shared life. Marshall learned that Ethan preferred showers in the evening rather than morning, that he unconsciously hummed while doing homework, that he could focus for hours on building elaborate structures with the architecture set that had unexpectedly become his favorite among the previously untouched gifts. Ethan discovered that Marshall was hopeless at cooking, but surprisingly skilled at building paper airplanes, that he knew fascinating stories about constellations, that he never made promises he couldn't keep. Small revelations accumulated like treasures between them. The cemetery visits continued daily, though now Marshall occasionally joined Ethan at the graveside rather than waiting by the car. He never interrupted the boys' private conversations with Jessica, but sometimes added his own wildflowers beside Ethan's offerings. One morning, after Ethan had finished speaking to his mother, Marshall cleared his throat. "Would it be all right if I had a moment with her?" he asked quietly. Ethan studied him with that disconcertingly perceptive gaze before nodding and stepping back to give Marshall privacy. Standing before Jessica's headstone, Marshall found himself momentarily speechless despite the conversations he'd rehearsed in his mind. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice low but steady, "for everything I didn't do, everything I should have been." He paused, gathering thoughts that seemed inadequate against the weight of his absence. "He's extraordinary, Jessica. You did that. You made him strong and kind and resilient. I promise I'll do everything in my power to deserve him." When he turned, he found Ethan watching him with an unreadable expression. They walked back to the car in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before. That evening, Ethan emerged from his room clutching a battered shoebox. "These were Mom's," he explained, setting it carefully on the coffee table between them. "Mrs. Wilson gave them to me after—" He trailed off, unable to directly reference his mother's absence. "I thought maybe you'd want to see." Inside the box lay the careful documentation of a life. Jessica's nursing program acceptance letter, never fulfilled due to financial constraints, a dried corsage from some forgotten celebration, movie ticket stubs, and photographs, dozens of them chronicling Ethan's growth from infancy to age 7. Marshall examined each one with reverent attention, noting Jessica's presence in many, her smile unchanged from his memories, though her eyes held a depth he hadn't recognized in their brief time together. "She kept a journal about you," Ethan said unexpectedly. "She wrote down everything. Your first words, when you got your first tooth, the day you took your first steps." He pulled a worn notebook from the bottom of the box. "She said, every important moment should be remembered." Marshall accepted the journal with hands that weren't quite steady, recognizing Jessica's handwriting immediately. The neat, decisive script recorded ordinary miracles. Ethan said Mama today. First day of kindergarten. He didn't cry, but I did. Lost first tooth at breakfast. So proud of how brave he was. These were the moments Marshall had forfeited, the ordinary magic of witnessing his son's life unfolding. Yet Jessica had documented everything, preserving these memories as if knowing someday they might matter to someone who wasn't there to witness them. "Thank you," Marshall said, his voice rough with emotion, "for sharing this with me." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "Mom always said forgetting is worse than being sad. That remembering keeps people with you, even when they're gone." The wisdom in the simple statement, wisdom Jessica had clearly instilled, left Marshall momentarily speechless. In that moment, he saw with perfect clarity how his own father's emotional absence had taught him to compartmentalize feelings, to sever connections cleanly, rather than risk messiness or pain. How different might his life have been with Jessica's philosophy of remembrance, rather than his practiced art of forgetting? Professional challenges emerged alongside the personal ones. Marshall's transformed priorities baffled his board of directors, particularly when he declined a lucrative international expansion opportunity that would have required extensive travel. "This isn't like you, Marshall," remarked Victor Ramirez, the longest-serving board member, after a particularly tense meeting. "The Thompson I know would never pass on Singapore just because it requires travel." Marshall considered his response carefully. "The Thompson you knew didn't have a 10-year-old son," he finally said. "Some opportunities aren't worth the cost anymore." The statement felt revolutionary as he spoke it, a public acknowledgement of values shifting beneath his feet. His executive assistant, Diana Chen, who had managed his life with terrifying efficiency for over a decade, adapted to the new reality with surprising enthusiasm. She rescheduled standing meetings to accommodate school events, learned Ethan's schedule and preferences, and once, memorably, appeared at Marshall's office door with an emergency science project kit when Ethan called in a panic about a forgotten assignment. "What?" she'd said defensively when Marshall raised an eyebrow at the volcano materials. "I have nephews. This is standard fourth-grade curriculum." Her matter-of-fact support made the transition smoother than Marshall had dared hope. As autumn faded into winter, Marshall faced the prospect of his first holiday season as a parent. Thanksgiving approached with its expectations of tradition and togetherness, concepts foreign to a man who typically spent holidays working or at obligatory industry functions. "What did you and your mum usually do for Thanksgiving?" he asked Ethan one evening as they cleared dinner dishes together, another small routine they'd established. Ethan shrugged, focusing intently on rinsing a plate. "Different things. Sometimes we went to the community dinner at church. Last year, Mrs. Wilson made turkey and stuffing for us." He hesitated before adding, "Mom always said it wasn't about the food, just being together." Marshall nodded, absorbing both the words and what remained unspoken. The years of making do, of finding celebration within limitation. "What would you like to do this year?" he asked, deliberately keeping his tone casual. "We could stay home, go to a restaurant, visit Mrs. Wilson, whatever you prefer." Ethan considered the question with his characteristic seriousness. "Could Mrs. Wilson come here?" he finally asked. "She gets lonely and her building is cold." The simple request, focusing not on his own desires but on the comfort of someone else, typified the quiet compassion that continually surprised Marshall about his son. "Of course," he agreed immediately. "We'll send my driver for her so she doesn't have to manage public transportation." The holiday planning unleashed unexpected enthusiasm in Marshall's household staff, who had maintained a respectful but warm relationship with Ethan since his arrival. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper who came 3 times weekly, offered traditional recipes. James, the groundskeeper, volunteered to help Ethan gather seasonal decorations from the estate's extensive gardens. Even Diana got involved, researching child-friendly Thanksgiving activities with her characteristic thoroughness. Watching these preparations unfold around him, Marshall realized how his wealth had always been directed toward acquisition rather than experience, toward impressing rather than nurturing. Now, for the first time, his resources were being channeled toward creating something that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. A sense of belonging, of family. The day before Thanksgiving, Marshall left work early to find Ethan and Mrs. Winters in the kitchen, flour dusting both their clothes as they tackled pie crust. The boy looked up with an expression Marshall had come to treasure, unguarded enjoyment, free from the wariness that had characterized their early interactions. "We're making pumpkin pie," Ethan announced, "and apple." "Mrs. Wilson says apple is traditional, but Mum always liked pumpkin best." The casual mention of Jessica, incorporated naturally into the moment rather than preserved as a separate sacred topic, signaled another small step in their evolving relationship. Later that evening, after Mrs. Winters departed and Ethan went upstairs to shower, Marshall found himself standing in his expensively appointed living room, surveying the transformation. Handmade paper turkeys decorated the normally pristine mantel. A slightly lopsided centerpiece of pine cones and autumn leaves adorned the dining table. Ingredients for tomorrow's meal covered the kitchen counters. The Thanksgiving gathering exceeded Marshall's expectations in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Mrs. Wilson arrived bearing hand-crocheted placemats and stories about Jessica that had Ethan alternating between laughter and solemn nods of recognition. Diana appeared unexpectedly with her husband and young daughters, adding cheerful chaos to the usually orderly home. Even James the groundskeeper joined them briefly, bringing a spectacular arrangement of late-blooming flowers from the greenhouse. The dining room that had hosted tense business negotiations now rang with conversation and laughter. Marshall, observing from his position at the head of the table, felt something unfamiliar expanding in his chest, a sense of fullness that had nothing to do with the abundant meal. When the time came for the traditional sharing of gratitude, Ethan surprised everyone by speaking first. "I'm thankful for Mrs. Wilson taking care of me," he said, his voice clear and steady. "And for Marshall giving me a home." He paused before adding quietly, "and for my mom who's still looking out for me even though she's not here." The simple statement brought tears to Mrs. Wilson's eyes and a tightness to Marshall's throat that made swallowing difficult. When his turn came, Marshall found himself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. "I'm grateful for second chances," he finally said, his eyes meeting Ethan's across the table, "and for the opportunity to know my son." The evening concluded with board games, another first in the Thompson household, and promises to repeat the gathering for Christmas. As Marshall helped Mrs. Wilson into the car that would take her home, she clasped his hand with surprising strength. "Jessica would be proud," she said quietly, "of both of you." The words stayed with him long after the guests departed, echoing as he moved through the quiet house, collecting abandoned napkins and water glasses. He found Ethan in the family room, examining the previously untouched photographs on the mantel, formal portraits of Marshall's parents, his sister's family in California, his own university graduation. "Is that your dad?" Ethan asked, pointing to a silver-framed image of Captain Thompson in full naval dress uniform. Marshall nodded, coming to stand beside him. "Yes, he was a Navy captain for 30 years. Ethan studied the stern face with interest. "Did you guys do stuff together? Like baseball games or fishing?" The innocent question illuminated the stark contrast between his own childhood and the one Marshall was attempting to provide. "Not often," Marshall admitted. "He was deployed frequently, and when he was home he searched for an appropriate description, not very comfortable with children or emotions." Ethan absorbed this information with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "That's sad," he finally said. "For both of you." The simple observation, offered without judgment but with genuine compassion, struck Marshall with the force of revelation. It was sad. The distance between himself and his father had always been framed as necessary discipline, as character-building separation, never as the mutual loss it truly represented. "Is that why you didn't know how to be a dad at first?" Ethan asked, his directness both startling and refreshing. "Because your dad didn't show you?" Marshall considered deflecting, offering a simplified explanation suitable for a child. Instead, he found himself answering with unexpected honesty. "Partly. And partly because I spent a long time focused on the wrong things, money and success, rather than people and relationships." Ethan nodded, seeming satisfied with the explanation. "You're learning, though," he offered, with the magnanimity of childhood. "You remembered I like cinnamon toast on rainy days. And you never miss school pickup, even when Diana says your phone has 17 messages." The casual acknowledgement of Marshall's efforts that felt inadequate against the years of absence, brought a surprising warmth to his chest. That night, after Ethan went to bed, Marshall sat in his office reviewing files his attorney had prepared weeks earlier. The paperwork for Ethan's formal adoption had been completed but held in abeyance, waiting for the right moment. Marshall had been hesitant to push, conscious of respecting Ethan's emotional timeline. Now, studying the documents that would legally make Ethan his son in every sense, He wondered if it was time to take this final step. The winter passed in a blur of school projects, weekend outings, and the gradual accumulation of shared references and inside jokes that form a family's private language. Christmas brought Ethan's first visit to the Thompson family mausoleum, an obligation Marshall had always discharged with detached efficiency. This year, standing beside his son before the imposing marble structure, he saw it through new eyes. "It's like a tiny palace," Ethan observed, his breath clouding in the December air. "Why is it so fancy when no one's really there?" The innocent question crystallized Marshall's growing discomfort with the mausoleum's cold grandeur. His parents, like generations of Thompsons before them, rested in climate-controlled isolation behind etched marble and polished brass, remembered with formality rather than warmth. "It's tradition," he explained, the words suddenly hollow. "The Thompson family has always been buried here." Ethan nodded, absorbing this information with his usual seriousness. "But Mom's not here," he said after a moment. "So you'll be buried somewhere else, right? With her?" The question, so matter-of-fact, yet laden with implications about belonging and forever, caught Marshall completely unprepared. Before he could formulate a response, Ethan continued with childlike practicality. "Because families should stay together, even after. That's what Mom always said." Standing there in the winter sunlight, Marshall recognized the truth that had been gradually reshaping his understanding of family. Jessica, a woman he'd known briefly but profoundly, had given him not only a son, but a legacy of love that transcended her physical presence. Her values lived on in Ethan's compassion, in his understanding of what truly mattered. "You're right," he agreed softly. "Families should stay together." The conversation lingered in Marshall's mind throughout the holiday season, catalyzing a decision he'd been contemplating since that first morning at Jessica's grave. In January, after consulting with Mrs. Wilson and Ethan, he initiated the process of establishing a family plot at Millfield Cemetery, a modest space where Jessica's remains would be relocated and where, someday far in the future, father and son might join her. The Thompson Mausoleum would continue housing his ancestors, but Marshall's future now lay along different lines. As winter grudgingly yielded to spring, Marshall faced his first formal parent-teacher conference with a nervousness that would have astonished his business associates. Ethan's academic performance had improved dramatically with stability and support, but socializing remained challenging for a boy whose life experience differed so markedly from his private school classmates. "Ethan is extremely bright," Miss Abernathy explained, reviewing his latest assessment results. "His mathematical reasoning and reading comprehension are well above grade level, but he still holds himself apart from his peers." She hesitated before adding gently, "He mentioned recently that he hasn't invited friends to your home because it might make them feel bad about their houses. That kind of sensitivity is unusual in children his age." Marshall nodded, recognizing the observation as perfectly aligned with Ethan's character. "What would you suggest?" Miss Abernathy smiled. "Perhaps start small, a birthday party, a weekend activity with 2 or 3 classmates. Create opportunities for him to build connections in a comfortable environment." The suggestion led to Ethan's first birthday celebration the following month, a carefully planned baseball outing with 3 chosen classmates, followed by pizza and cake at home. Marshall watched from a slight distance as Ethan navigated the social dynamics with his characteristic thoughtfulness, momentarily uncertain, but gradually relaxing into genuine enjoyment. "Did you like your birthday?" Marshall asked that evening, as they cleaned up the remnants of celebration. Ethan nodded, carefully storing leftover cake in the container Mrs. Winters had provided. "It was nice. Different, but nice." He hesitated before adding, "Mom and I usually just had cupcakes from the bakery near our apartment. One time she saved up for weeks to take me to the Natural History Museum." The memory brought a smile to his face. "She let me stay at the dinosaur exhibit for 3 whole hours." Marshall absorbed this glimpse into their previous life, adding it to the mental mosaic he was assembling of Jessica and Ethan's time together. "What would she think about today's celebration?" he asked carefully. Ethan considered the question with characteristic seriousness. "She'd be happy I had friends over," he decided. "But she'd probably say the baseball tickets cost too much." His expression grew thoughtful. She was always worried about money. The simple observation reinforced what Marshall had come to understand through their months together. that Ethan's perspective had been profoundly shaped by years of economic insecurity. Despite now living with every material advantage, he still saved the smallest scraps of paper, still finished every morsel on his plate, still hesitated before mentioning needs or wants. Watching Ethan carefully wrap leftover pizza for tomorrow's lunch, Marshall felt the familiar ache of opportunities lost. Years when he could have eased their struggles, provided security, been present for both Jessica and their son. The regret must have shown on his face because Ethan looked up with unexpected perceptiveness. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Mom always said life doesn't give do-overs, just new chances." The wisdom in the simple statement, Jessica's wisdom passed through their son, left Marshall momentarily speechless. 1 year after first noticing Ethan in the cemetery, Marshall stood before a judge in the same courtroom where he'd received custody. This time, however, Ethan stood beside him by choice rather than necessity. His hand voluntarily slipped into Marshall's as the adoption paperwork was finalized. "Ethan Thompson," the judge announced with a warm smile. "Congratulations on your new legal name and official family status." The small gathering, Mrs. Wilson, Gabriella, Dr. Chen, Diana and her family, erupted in applause as Ethan accepted the judge's handshake with solemn dignity. The celebration afterward was Ethan's design, a picnic at the cemetery where Jessica could, in his words, be part of it too. Marshall watched as his son carefully arranged wildflowers before the new headstone they'd selected together, larger than the original, with space for photographs and a small bench where visitors could sit comfortably. "See, Mom?" Ethan said, his voice carrying in the spring air. "It's official now, but I told Marshall I'm keeping Riley as my middle name, so I still have a piece of you with me." Marshall hung back, giving them privacy for this conversation. He'd gradually learned when to step forward and when to maintain distance, when to offer guidance and when to simply witness. The lessons of fatherhood had come late, but were absorbed with the same intensity he'd once directed toward business acquisitions. "Can Marshall come say hi too?" Ethan called, waving him forward. As he approached, Marshall noted the freshly engraved stone that now bore 3 names. Jessica's in the center, Ethan's beneath it, and his own, Marshall Thompson, discreetly added at the bottom corner. The arrangement had been Ethan's idea, a visible representation of their unconventional family connection. "We did it, Jess," Marshall said softly, using the nickname he'd called her all those years ago. "He's officially a Thompson now, though I think we both know he's teaching me more than I could ever teach him." Ethan smiled at this, leaning slightly against Marshall's side, one of the casual physical connections that had gradually become natural between them. As they walked back toward the car where Mrs. Wilson waited, Ethan looked up with his characteristic directness. "What do I call you now?" he asked. "Now that the adoption is final?" The question caught Marshall by surprise. Throughout their year together, Ethan had called him Marshall. Never dad or father or any variation that might suggest replacement of the mother who had been his entire world. "Whatever feels right to you," Marshall answered carefully. "My name is still fine." Ethan nodded, considering this as they continued walking. "Maybe sometimes for special occasions I could call you Dad," he suggested, his tone making it clear this was a gift being offered rather than an expectation being fulfilled. "For regular days, you can still be Marshall." The simple solution, so characteristic of Ethan's thoughtful nature, brought unexpected emotion to Marshall's throat. "I'd like that very much," he managed. As they reached the car, Ethan turned for one final look at the cemetery where their journey had begun, the place where a boy's faithful devotion had given a man his most unexpected second chance. "She's not alone anymore," Ethan said with satisfaction. "None of us are." Marshall's arm settled lightly across his son's shoulders as they stood together in the spring sunshine, 3 names now connected by more than just letters carved in stone. "No," he agreed softly. "None of us are alone anymore."